The date is February of 1944, and inside Stalag Luft III, a German prisoner of war camp buried in the pine forests of Lower Silesia, a Luftwaffe officer named Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindner Wildahl is conducting his morning inspection. He moves through the compound with the measured confidence of a man who believes he has solved a problem. The perimeter wire is double-layered, with a warning rail set 30 feet inside it. Any prisoner who crosses that rail invites a guard in one of the elevated sentry boxes to open fire without challenge. The ground between the barracks and the wire has been cleared of vegetation, raked flat, and floodlit at night with arc lamps powerful enough to read by. Microphones have been buried in the soil at intervals of roughly 20 feet, connected by cable to listening posts staffed around the clock. The barracks themselves are built on stilts 18 inches above the ground, so that any tunneling activity can be observed from below by guards making circuit patrols. The camp holds over 10,000 Allied airmen. Von Lindner has been its commandant since 1942. He is, by the standards of the German prison system, a relatively humane administrator. He is also a man who genuinely believes that no organized, sustained resistance operation could be running inside his camp without his knowledge. He is wrong about that in a way that will cost him his career, his freedom, and nearly his life. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand how completely von Lindner had been deceived, you need to understand what he thought he was managing. In the German military conception of prisoner of war camps, the primary security problem was the individual escape attempt, the lone prisoner or small group who, acting on personal initiative, dug a hole under a fence or forged a single document and made a run for it. German doctrine addressed this threat methodically. Guards, random roll calls, physical searches, informants, the architecture of the camp itself. All of it was calibrated to detect and defeat the improvised, opportunistic escape attempt driven by individual desperation. What German security doctrine had not fully reckoned with was something categorically different, not the desperate improvisation of a man who sees a momentary gap in a wire, but a functioning military organization operating inside the camp with a command structure, a budget, a counterintelligence section, a manufacturing division, a foreign language department, a document forgery operation, and a long-range strategic plan approved by senior officers and carried out by hundreds of men over the course of more than a year. Von Lindner was not facing prisoners trying to escape. He was facing a military unit that had decided escape was its mission and had organized itself accordingly. The man who built that organization was a Royal Canadian Air Force officer named Roger Bushell. He was 33 years old. Before the war, he had been a barrister in London, a competitive skier who had raced for Britain in the Alps, and a man described by everyone who knew him as possessing an almost reckless disregard for a personal risk combined with an exceptionally precise legal mind. He had been shot down over Dunkirk in May of 1940 and captured by the Germans. He had already escaped twice. After his second recapture, the Gestapo had delivered him to Stalag Luft III in the spring of 1943 with a person notation in his file. This man was to be watched with exceptional care. They put him in a camp surrounded by microphones and guards and 30 feet of clear ground and arc lamps. And within weeks of his arrival, he had begun building the most sophisticated covert resistance organization in the history of Allied captivity. It is worth pausing here to account for what Bushell was working with, because the gap between his resources and his ambitions was staggering. He had no tools except what could be improvised, stolen, or manufactured from materials the Germans had deemed harmless. He had no communications with the outside world, except what could be smuggled through guards who were carefully cultivated and occasionally bribed. He had no maps except those hand-copied from German newspapers, and atlases borrowed from the camp library. He had no German currency except what could be accumulated through patient accumulation and occasional forgery. He had no civilian clothing except what could be tailored in secret from dyed RAF uniforms and whatever fabric could be obtained through legitimate and illegitimate means. What he did have was 10,000 men, a substantial fraction of whom possessed skills that in peacetime had made them engineers, lawyers, chemists, architects, linguists, actors, printers, and craftsmen of every description. And he had something else. He had the organizational framework that the Royal Air Force had already given every man in that camp. The habits of hierarchy, of mission planning, of compartmentalization, of operating under pressure toward a defined objective. The Germans had captured airmen. What they had not quite understood was that they had captured officers, and that officers, by training and by temperament, do not stop working simply because their immediate circumstances are inconvenient. Bushell called his organization the X-Organization. The name was deliberately mundane. The command structure was simple but functional. Bushell himself held the title of Big X. Beneath him, each major department of the operation had its own head, its own staff, and its own security protocols. The departments did not know the full details of each other's operations. A man who worked in the document forgery section knew what documents he was forging and nothing else. A man who worked in the tunnel construction crew knew the dimensions and progress of the tunnel, and nothing about the false identity papers being prepared for the men who would use it. This compartmentalization was not bureaucratic habit. It was deliberate counterintelligence discipline. If a man was caught and interrogated, he could only compromise a fragment of the operation he had personally touched. The Germans' most powerful tool for penetrating prisoner organizations was the informant, a prisoner, usually a non-commissioned officer or a man under particular personal pressure, who agreed to pass information to the camp security staff in exchange for small privileges or relief from threats. Every prisoner of war camp in Germany had them, and every prisoner knew they existed. Bushell's response to this threat was the security section, which he placed under a South African officer named George Harsh. Harsh had a background that was, to put it gently, unconventional. Before the war, while a student in the American South, he had been convicted of murder during a robbery and had spent 12 years on a Georgia chain gang before being pardoned. He had then emigrated to Canada, joined the Royal Canadian Air Force, and been shot down over Germany. He was, by any measure, not a man easily intimidated, and he had spent enough time in an institution where informants were a constant mortal danger to understand exactly how to neutralize them. Harsh section developed what was essentially a counterintelligence service. Suspected informants were identified through careful observation of their behavior, whom they spoke to, where they went, what questions they asked. Confirmed informants were not confronted or reported to the Germans, which would have revealed the organization's awareness of the threat. Instead, they were fed carefully constructed false information. They were allowed to discover apparent escape preparations that did not exist, tunnels in locations where no tunnels were being dug, document forgeries of types that had already been abandoned. The German security staff, receiving reports from their informants, expended considerable energy searching for threats that were phantoms while the actual operation continued untouched in the places no informant had been allowed to see. This operation required a level of sustained, coordinated deception that in peacetime would have been considered extraordinary. Inside a prisoner of war camp, under conditions of constant surveillance and physical deprivation, it was simply the organization's daily routine. The tunnel operation itself. Bushell had decided early that the only escape attempt worth planning was one large enough to justify the organizational investment it required. Individual escapes, he had concluded after 2 failed attempts of his own, produced minimal strategic value. A man who slipped over the wire alone might inconvenience the Germans for a few days and perhaps, if extraordinarily lucky, reach Switzerland or a neutral port. What Bushell wanted was something that would require the Germans to pull hundreds of thousands of troops off the front lines and into the interior of their own country to conduct a manhunt. He wanted to move not 1 man or 3 men to the wire, but 200. To move 200 men required a tunnel, or rather, as Bushell eventually concluded, 3 tunnels. The logic was straightforward and characteristically uncompromising. The Germans would eventually find any tunnel under construction. If there was only 1, finding it ended the operation. If there were 3 running simultaneously, then finding 1, or even 2, left the third intact. He named them Tom, Dick, and Harry. Construction on all 3 began in the spring of 1943. The engineering challenges were formidable enough that Bushell established a separate department, staffed by officers with civil engineering backgrounds, to address them. The fundamental problem was soil. The ground beneath Stalag Luft 3 was composed of a pale yellow sand that was visually distinctive. Any significant excavation would produce quantities of this sand that had to be disposed of without the Germans noticing its appearance on the surface of the compound. The surface soil was a darker, grayish-brown. Any pile of yellow sand appearing anywhere in the compound would immediately tell a guard's eyes that digging was occurring somewhere below. The disposal problem was solved through a system that became one of the most ingeniously mundane aspects of the entire operation. Prisoners were fitted beneath their trousers, with bags sewn from the legs of long underwear. These bags could hold several pounds of yellow sand each, and were designed with a drawstring release at the bottom. A prisoner carrying a loaded bag would walk casually into the compound's garden area or along any stretch of earth, release the drawstring with a slight movement of the hand, and allow the sand to fall invisibly through his trouser leg onto the ground as he walked. The sand was then worked into the surface soil by the natural foot traffic of the compound. The men who performed this function were called penguins, and at the operation's peak, there were over 150 of them, each making multiple circuits of the compound every day, each carrying and releasing several pounds of sand per trip. In the course of the tunneling operation, the penguins dispersed over 100 tons of yellow subsoil into the compound surface without the German security staff detecting it. The tunnel entrances themselves were engineering achievements worthy of professional respect. The entrance to Harry, the tunnel that would ultimately be used, was concealed beneath a cast iron stove in Barak 104. The stove's base was constructed so that it appeared to rest solidly on the floor, but could be lifted free by 2 men in under a minute, revealing a shaft approximately 2 feet square dropping 8 feet straight down into the sand. The shaft was lined with wooden boards. The boards came from the prisoners' bed frames, each man having surrendered 2 or 3 of the roughly 15 boards supporting his mattress, leaving the remainder spread wide enough to prevent the mattress from collapsing through, while the missing boards would go unremarked in a casual inspection. At the bottom of the shaft, the tunnel ran horizontally toward the wire at a depth of 28 feet, deep enough to be below the reach of the German listening devices buried at 12 to 18 feet. The tunnel was 2 feet square in cross-section. It was lit by a continuous electric lighting system, fat lamps initially, burning margarine and using pajama cord as wicks, replaced later by a system that tapped directly into the camp's electrical supply through a junction that the camp's German electricians had never located. It was ventilated by a bellows system constructed from kit bags and powdered milk tins, pumping fresh air through a pipe made from the same tin cans flattened and soldered together by men who had never been trained as tinners but had become remarkably competent ones. It had a railway, a wheeled trolley that ran on rails made from wooden bedboards, pulled by a rope, allowing excavated sand to be moved from the face back to the shaft without requiring the digger to crawl backward through 300 feet of tunnel, carrying a bag in his teeth. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The document forgery operation, which Bushel placed under a Czech officer named Tim Whalen, was in some respects even more remarkable than the tunneling. A man emerging from a tunnel in the middle of the German countryside at night needed more than a hole in the ground. He needed a complete false identity capable of surviving scrutiny from German police, railway officials, and military checkpoint personnel. That identity required specific documents. The precise documents varied depending on the cover story, but for most escapees the minimum requirement was a German identity card, a travel permit, a work permit, and in some cases a letter from an employer or military authority explaining the bearer's presence on a particular route at a particular time. These documents were not copied from memory or sketched from description. The forgery section obtained genuine German documents through a combination of methods. Some were provided by guards who had been cultivated and occasionally bribed with Red Cross food parcels. Some were briefly borrowed during the systematic distraction of German security personnel during inspections. Some were obtained from German newspapers, which published samples of official documents and articles about administrative procedures. Each genuine document was studied, measured, and reproduced by a team of artists working with materials that in peacetime would have been considered utterly inadequate. Ink was made from boot polish and graphite. Paper was obtained from the pages of books, the backs of maps, the inner surfaces of food packaging. Rubber stamps were carved from boot heels. Typewriting was duplicated by hand, letter by letter, with a precision that under examination by German police passed as machine-produced. By the time Bushel had fixed the escape date, the document section had produced over 250 sets of forged papers. Each set was tailored to a specific individual, a specific cover story, and a specific planned route. A man traveling as a French forced laborer needed different documents from a man traveling as a German civilian businessman. A man whose cover story placed him in Munich needed different travel authorizations from a man whose story put him in Hamburg. Whalen's section tracked all of this in a card index system organized with the meticulousness of a law firm's case files. The clothing section faced parallel challenges. A man emerging from a tunnel in an RAF uniform would be arrested within minutes in any public space in Germany. Most escapees required complete civilian clothing, suits, coats, civilian shoes, or, for those taking military cover stories, authentic-looking German or other Axis military uniforms. The raw materials were, again, whatever could be improvised. RAF greatcoats were dyed with boot polish and coffee and recut by men who had taught themselves tailoring from a book borrowed from the camp library. A German Luftwaffe uniform was constructed from a RAF battle dress, using thread unraveled from blankets and buttons replaced with carved wooden replicas painted with boot polish. The results were not perfect. They did not need to be. They needed to survive a glance from a tired railway official at a busy wartime station, and that was a very different standard from surviving the scrutiny of a tailor's eye. The intelligence section, which gathered information about routes, railway timetables, German checkpoint procedures, and conditions in specific German cities, operated through a network that extended well beyond the wire. Some information came from guards who were, with great care, cultivated into providing camp newspapers and magazines. Some came from new prisoners who arrived with recent knowledge of conditions in Germany. Some came from the camp library, whose holdings of pre-war travel guides, atlases, and language instruction books were systematically mined for information that remained relevant. Some came from the Red Cross parcels themselves, whose contents, maps printed on silk, compasses concealed in game pieces, currency hidden in the false bottoms of tins, were the product of a separate British organization, MIS-9, whose entire purpose was to assist Allied prisoners in escaping. The connection between the X organization inside Stalag Luft III and the British escape services outside represented a communications channel that the Germans were never able to close despite being aware of its existence. Letters home from prisoners contained coded information about camp conditions and escape requirements. Letters from family members contained coded responses. The code systems were changed regularly to stay ahead of German censors who had become, by early 1944, extremely sophisticated readers of prisoner correspondence. Von Lindener's security staff, his ferrets, as the prisoners called them, the plainclothes German security men who roamed the compound trying to detect escape preparations, were not incompetent. They found Tunnel Tom in September of 1943 after a search triggered by a chance discovery. They had suspicions about the area around the barrack housing Harry's entrance for months. They searched that barrack 17 times and never found the entrance because the cast iron stove over the shaft was moved back into place and the shaft sealed from inside with precision that left no visible seam. The 16th and 17th searches found nothing that the first 14 had not found, and the ferrets moved on with a reasonable conclusion that whatever their informants had hinted at in that barrack, it was not there anymore. It was still there. It had never stopped being there. The men beneath Stalag Luft III were still digging, still forging, still tailoring, still briefing, still making their preparations with the unhurried patience of an organization that knew exactly what it was doing and had determined to do it completely or not at all. The escape was set for the night of the 24th of March, 1944. Harry by that date extended 336 feet from the entrance shaft to a point that the surveying team, prisoners who had used the limited tools available to them to calculate the tunnel's length and direction with improvised instruments, believed lay beyond perimeter wire and into the cover of the pine forest beyond. The surveying team was accurate in almost every respect. In one critical measurement, they were off by about 15 feet. The tunnel emerged not in the pine forest, but in a cleared area still within the sight line of a guard tower. That 15 feet would, in the hours that followed, carry consequences that no one in the X organization had fully anticipated when Bushel had given the order to open the tunnel. 200 men had been selected for the escape, ranked by the value of their contribution to the organization and by the quality of their German and their cover stories. The first 30 were fluent German speakers with civilian dress, forged papers for train travel, and the best chance of reaching a neutral country. The remainder were hard-assers, men who would travel on foot to the German countryside, living off what they could find, heading for the forests and mountains on the theory that 200 men loose in Germany simultaneously would overwhelm the search capacity of local police no matter how many of them were eventually caught. The escape began at 10:30 on the night of March 24th. It proceeded with the methodical discipline the organization had spent a year building. Men crawled to the tunnel one by one, rolled the trolley to the face, pulled themselves forward, emerged into the cold March night. The pace was slower than planned. A blackout on the camp's perimeter meant the electric lighting had been switched off, leaving the tunnel in darkness and requiring each man to use a fat lamp, which slowed movement and consumed a limited air supply. A partial collapse near the shaft entrance required repair that cost over an hour. The exit point location in the open rather than in the forest required each man to wait, lie in the snow at the tunnel mouth, until a rope signal from a lookout indicated that the guard in the nearest tower was looking away before crawling forward into the tree line. Despite everything, 76 men made it to the tunnel before a German guard discovered the exit at approximately 5 in the morning. He was, according to accounts, more startled than the prisoner he caught emerging from ground. The guard raised the alarm. The camp went into lockdown. Roll call revealed that 76 men were missing. The largest escape in the history of Allied captivity was over. What followed it was something that the men who had planned the escape had known was likely, had discussed with characteristic directness, and had decided did not change the strategic calculation enough to stop them. The manhunt that the German authorities launched on the morning of March 25th, 1944 engaged approximately 5 million German personnel across the Reich. Police, Gestapo, Wehrmacht garrison troops, Hitler Youth, civilian volunteers, railway officials placed on alert, and border control personnel, given the photographs and descriptions of the escapees from the ex-organization's own records, which had been meticulously maintained and were now in German hands. This was precisely what Bushel had wanted. 5 million Germans looking inward, away from the fronts, chasing men through forests and railway stations and border checkpoints, represented a diversion of resources that no bombing raid and no ground operation could have achieved at comparable cost. Of the 76 men who escaped, 3 reached safety: a Norwegian officer named Per Bergsland and a Dutch officer named Bram van der Stok made it to Sweden by separate routes. A Dutchman named Bram van der Stok, a Norwegian officer named Jens Moller reached Sweden alongside Bergsland, while van der Stok made it through Spain. 73 were recaptured. Of those 73, 50 were executed on the direct order of Adolf Hitler, who had been informed of the escape while it was still in progress, and whose fury at the audacity of the operation had driven him past any pretense of following the Geneva Convention's protections for prisoners of war. The executions were carried out by the Gestapo in small groups over several days in late March and early April 1944. The men taken from their places of recapture and shot in isolated locations. Their deaths reported to the camp as having occurred while attempting to resist rearrest. Roger Bushel was among the 50. He was recaptured near Saarbrücken with a French officer named Bernard Scheidhauer. Both men were shot on March 29, 1944, on a stretch of road near Kaiserslautern. Bushel was 33 years old. The news reached Stalag Luft 3 in stages, and each stage was worse than the one before it. In the days immediately following the escape, the prisoners who remained in the camp existed in a state of suspended dread. They knew that 76 men had made it through the tunnel. They knew that 3 had not been brought back. What they did not know, and what the German authorities were in no hurry to tell them, was what had happened to the 73 who had been recaptured. The senior British officer at the camp was Group Captain Herbert Massey, a First World War veteran who had lost a leg in combat and walked with a cane. Massey requested information through official channels about the status of the missing men. The Germans told him they were being held at various police stations and would be returned to the camp in due course. Days passed, then weeks. The men did not return. On April 15, 1944, von Lindener, who had by then been relieved of command, placed under arrest by his own government, and was awaiting court-martial for security failures that had allowed the escape, was replaced by a new commandant. It was this new officer who eventually summoned Massey and informed him, with what witnesses described as visible discomfort, that 41 of the missing men had been shot while attempting to resist rearrest or escape recapture. The number changed over the following days as additional notifications arrived. It rose to 47, then to 50. Massey requested the urn containing the ashes of the dead. The Germans had cremated the bodies before notification, a fact that in itself told the senior officers everything they needed to know about the circumstances of the deaths. The urns were delivered to the camp. Massey convened a formation of the entire British compound, and the prisoners stood in silence while the names were read. Of the men who had built Harry, who had forged the documents, who had tailored the uniforms, who had dispersed the sand, who had operated the bellows, who had maintained the counterintelligence watch, 50 were dead, murdered, though the word being used in the official German notifications was resisting. The men who remained in the camp understood immediately and with complete certainty what had happened. The Geneva Convention was explicit. Prisoners of war who escaped and were recaptured would be returned to their camp or transferred to another, with no punishment beyond a period of solitary confinement not exceeding 30 days. Shooting a recaptured prisoner of war was not a disciplinary measure. It was a war crime. And the scale of it, 50 men, killed across multiple locations over multiple days by multiple Gestapo units acting on orders that could only have come from the highest levels of the German government, made it one of the most deliberate and systematic war crimes committed against Western Allied prisoners in the entire conflict. The senior officers in the camp made a decision that reflected exactly the organizational discipline that had built the escape in the first place. They would document everything: names, dates, the last known locations of the recaptured men, the circumstances of their capture as reported by the handful who had been returned alive, the discrepancies in the German notifications, every detail that could later be used to identify who had given the orders and who had carried them out. The documentation was maintained with the same meticulous care that the X-organization had brought to its forged identity papers and its card index of escapees. It was kept hidden from the Germans with the same security protocols that had protected the tunnel. And when liberation came, it would be handed to Allied investigators as a complete evidentiary record. That liberation came from men of Stalag Luft III not on a single dramatic day, but through a forced march in January of 1945, as the Soviet Army's winter offensive drove deep into Silesia, and the Germans evacuated the camp rather than allow its prisoners to be liberated in place. 10,000 men were marched westward through one of the coldest European winters on record, in temperatures that dropped below -20 Celsius, on roads congested with German civilian refugees fleeing the same Soviet advance. The march lasted 3 days and covered approximately 100 kilometers. Men fell from exhaustion and cold, were dragged upright by the men beside them, and kept walking. The Germans provided almost no food and no shelter beyond whatever farmhouses and barns could be commandeered along the route. Several men died. None of the senior officers who had built and led the X-organization lost a man from their immediate group, a fact that owed something to luck and something to the same methodical preparation that had characterized everything the organization had done. The men were eventually transported by train to camps in Germany proper, where they remained until liberation by American forces in the spring of 1945. The documentation they had compiled during the weeks after the murders was intact. It went with them through the march, through the train transport, through the final weeks of captivity, carried by men who had decided that even if they could not avenge the 50, they could ensure that the men who killed them would one day have to account for it. The war crimes investigation that followed liberation was conducted jointly by the Royal Air Force and the British Judge Advocate General's Department. It began in the summer of 1945 and continued for nearly 3 years. The investigators had the documentation compiled by the prisoners. They had access, as Germany's records fell into Allied hands, to the communications between Gestapo regional offices, the Reich Security Main Office, and ultimately the office of Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who as head of the Reich Security Main Office had transmitted Hitler's order that the recaptured officers were to be shot. They had witnesses, surviving Gestapo officers who, facing their own trials, were willing to provide testimony in exchange for consideration, and former prisoners who had been present at various stages of the organization's operation and the aftermath. What the investigation reconstructed piece by piece was a chain of command that ran from Hitler's original order, given in a fury on the morning of March 25th to a group that included Heinrich Himmler, Hermann Göring, and Wilhelm Keitel, down through Kaltenbrunner's office to the regional Gestapo offices responsible for the areas where the recaptured men had been held, and finally to the specific officers who had driven the prisoners to their execution sites and pulled the triggers. The order had been given. It had been transmitted through official channels. It had been carried out by named individuals who had submitted reports confirming its completion. 18 Gestapo officers and officials were tried by a British military tribunal at Hamburg in 1947 and 48. 14 were convicted. 13 were sentenced to death. 11 of those death sentences were carried out. 2 sentences were commuted to imprisonment. The investigation was remarkable not only for its outcomes, but for the evidentiary standard it met, a standard that would not have been achievable without the documentation compiled inside the camp by men who had known, in the immediate aftermath of the murders, that the only power available to them was the power of careful record-keeping. Von Lindinger himself was not among those tried for murders. He had been in German military custody awaiting court-martial when the executions occurred and had no part in them. After the war, he provided testimony to British investigators that proved useful in establishing the timeline and the chain of command. He spent time in British captivity, was released in 1947, and returned to civilian life in Germany. He died in 1963. In later years, several of the former prisoners who had been under his command at Stalag Luft 3 wrote accounts that acknowledged his relative humanity, not as exoneration, but as an accurate accounting of the man. He had run a prison camp with reasonable competence in a system built on a criminal ideology, and when the system had revealed its criminal nature most explicitly in the shooting of 50 of his former prisoners, he had been in a cell, stripped of his command, and was himself a prisoner. The 3 men who had reached safety, Bergsland, Muller, and van der Stock, returned to active service and survived the war. Van der Stock, the Dutch officer who had made it through Spain and Portugal to reach England, flew operational missions with the Royal Air Force until the end of the war, and later emigrated to the United States, where he practiced medicine for decades. He outlived most of the men who had known him at Stalag Luft 3 and died in California in 1993 at the age of 81. Bergsland and Muller both returned to Norway and lived long lives. Bergsland died in 2006. He was the last surviving member of the 76 who had made it through Harry. The men of the X organization who survived, the ones who had not been selected for the escape because their German was insufficient or their cover stories too fragile or their numbers simply too high in the ranking, carried what they had built and what they had lost for the rest of their lives. George Harsh, the South African counterintelligence chief who had run the security section with the experience of a man who had spent 12 years understanding how institutions try to control human beings, wrote a memoir after the war that described the X organization with clarity and a lack of sentimentality that made it the most useful single account of how the operation actually functioned day to day. He was writing, he said, not to glorify what had been done, but to make sure it was understood correctly. What had been done was not heroic improvisation. It was systematic, professional, disciplined military work, carried out by men who had decided that captivity was a continuation of service by other means. Tim Whalen, who had run the document forgery section, survived the war and returned to England. The card index of forged documents his section had maintained, the record of every identity paper produced for every escapee, was among the documentation that British investigators used in the war crimes trial. The forgeries themselves, some of which had been recovered from the bodies of the executed men, were examined by German police document experts called as prosecution witnesses who confirmed under oath that they would not have detected the papers as forged under normal checkpoint conditions. The men who had made those documents from boot polish and unraveled blanket thread had produced work that professional German police considered authentic. That testimony was delivered in a Hamburg courtroom in 1947, and it must have carried a particular quality of satisfaction for anyone who understood what it meant. The camp itself, Stalag Luft 3, was in what became Polish territory after the war's end, the boundary of post-war Poland having been moved significantly westward. The barracks were demolished. The cleared ground around perimeter was gradually reclaimed by the pine forest. The tunnel Harry collapsed in sections over the years as the timber lining rotted and the sandy soil above it shifted. Nothing marks its line today with any precision. though archaeologists working in the area in recent years have located portions of the tunnel and portions of the ventilation pipe system that the prisoners had soldered from powdered milk tins. The memorial to the 50 executed men is at the site in Poznan, Poland, near Zagan, where the camp stood. Polish authorities have maintained it since the 1980s. It is modest, a stone marker in a stand of pine trees. But it is there, and it records the 50 names, and it stands in a country that was itself a prisoner of the same system that killed them. What happened inside Stalag Luft 3 between the spring of 1943 and the night of March 24th, 1944 is, at its foundation, a story about what a military organization can accomplish when it applies military discipline to a problem that appears to have no military solution. Von Lindinger had built a camp designed to hold men by removing from them every resource that individual action required: tools, materials, information, freedom of movement. What he had not found a way to remove was the thing that made them officers in the first place: the capacity to assess a problem, identify its components, assign specialists to each component, establish a command structure, maintain security, and execute a plan over a sustained period with the patience and precision that complex operations demand. The X organization did not succeed because its members were unusually brave, though many of them were. It did not succeed because they were unusually clever, though several of them were that too. It succeeded because they treated escape not as a desperate individual gamble, but as a military mission, and they brought to that mission every professional habit that the Royal Air Force had spent years installing in them. The habits survived captivity. The habits survived privation, boredom, cold, the constant psychological pressure of confinement, and the ever-present knowledge that the organization they were building would, if discovered, result in consequences far worse than solitary confinement. Those habits survived because the men who held them had been trained, before any of this began, to believe that the mission continued as long as they were alive and capable of working. That belief was not unique to them. It was standard military doctrine for Allied airmen, drummed into every crew before they flew their first operational sortie. But inside Stalag Luft 3, surrounded by microphones and wire and arc lamps and guards who had been told that this camp was escape-proof, that standard doctrine produced something that the German military had not anticipated when it designed its prison system. It produced an army operating behind enemy lines that had never left the camp. Go back to where this started. February of 1944. Von Lindinger walking his morning inspection. The perimeter wire. The cleared ground. The arc lamps. The microphones. A commandant who believed he had solved the problem of the men in his custody. 30 feet below the compound where he walked, Harry was almost complete. In the barack above the entrance shaft, men were checking forged documents against cover stories for the 100th time. In the tailor's room, the last civilian coats were being pressed. In the security section, the counterintelligence watch was running its morning circuits, maintaining the deception that had kept 3 tunnels invisible for nearly a year. 5 million Germans would be pulled from their posts to look for men who had, for 12 months, been invisible in plain sight. They could not explain it when it was over. The guards who had searched that barack 17 times. The ferrets who had been fed false intelligence until they stopped trusting their own informants. The commandant who had believed in his perimeter. They could not explain how an organization of that size and sophistication had operated directly beneath their feet for that length of time without detection. The answer was not technology or unusual resources or any advantage of circumstance. The answer was that the men inside Stalag Luft 3 had never stopped being soldiers, and soldiers, when given a mission and professional discipline to pursue it, have a tendency to find ways through obstacles that from the outside appear impenetrable. The wire was real. The microphones were real. The arc lamps were real. None of it was enough. Because the thing those defenses were designed to contain was not a body. It was a decision, and that no perimeter in Germany had been built wide enough to hold. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.